The Life of Harriet Tubman, page 57. At one time Harriet was much troubled in spirit about her three brothers, feeling sure that some great evil was impending over their heads. She wrote a letter, by the hand of a friend, to a man named Jacob Jackson, who lived near there. Jacob was a free Negro. He could both read and write, and who was under suspicion at that time, as it had been thought he had something to do with the disappearance of so many slaves. It was necessary, therefore, to be very cautious in writing to him. Jacob had an adopted son, William Henry Jackson, also free, who had come south, and so Harriet determined to sign her letter with his name, knowing that Jacob would be clever enough to understand, by her particular phraseology, what meanings she intended to convey to him. She therefore, after speaking of indifferent matters, said, "Read my letter to the old folks, and give my love to them, and tell my brothers to be always watching unto prayer, and when the good old ship of Zion comes along, be ready to step aboard." The letter was signed, William Henry Jackson. Jacob was not allowed to have letters till the self-elected inspector had had the reading of them, and studied into their secret meaning. They, therefore, got together with their glasses and got them on, and proceeded to a careful perusal of this mysterious document. What it meant they could not imagine. William Henry Jackson had no parents or brothers, and the letter was incomprehensible. White genius having exhausted itself, black genius was called in, and Jacob's letter was at last handed to him. Jacob saw it once what it meant, but tossed it down, saying, "That letter can't be meant for me, nohow. I can't make heads or tail of it," and walked off and took immediate measures to let Harriet's brothers know secretly that she was coming, and they must be ready to start at a moment's notice for the North. When Harriet arrived there, it was the day before Christmas, and she found her three brothers, who had attempted to escape, were advertised to be sold on Christmas Day to the highest bidder, to go down to the cotton and rice fields with the chain gang. Christmas came on Sunday, and therefore they were not to be sold till Monday. Harriet arrived on Saturday and gave them secret notice to be ready to start Saturday night, immediately after dark, the first stopping place to be their father's cabin 40 miles away. When they assembled, their brother John was missing, but when Harriet was ready, the word was "forward," and she nibbler waited for no one. Poor John was almost ready to start when his wife was taken ill, and in an hour or two another little inheritor of the blessings of slavery had come into the world. John must go off for a granny, and then he would leave his wife in her present circumstances. But after the birth of the child he began to think he must start the North and liberty, or the South and lifelong slavery. These were the alternatives, and this was his last chance. He tried again and again to steal out of the door, but a watchful eye was on him, and he was always arrested by the question, "Where you going, John?" At length he told her he was going to try to see if he couldn't get hired out on Christmas to another man. His wife did not think that he was to be sold. He went out of the door and stood by the corner of the house near her bed listening. At length he heard her sobbing and crying, and not being able to endure it, he went back. "Oh, John," said his wife, "you're going to leave me, but where'd we go? Remember, me and children." John went out and started at full speed to his father's cabin 40 miles away. At daybreak he overtook the others at the Fowler house near the cabin of their parents. Harriet had not seen her mother there for 6 years, but they did not dare to let the old woman know of their being in the neighborhood or of their intentions, for she would have raised such an uproar in her efforts to detain them with her that the whole plantation would have been alarmed. The poor old woman had been expecting the boys all day to spend Christmas with her as usual. She had been hard at work, had killed a pig, and put it to all the various uses to which sinner's flesh is doomed, and had made all the preparations for her circumstances admitted of, to give them a stupendous entertainment, and there she sat watching. In the night, when Harriet and 2 of her brothers and 2 other men who had escaped with them arrived at the Fowler house, they were exhausted and famished. They sent the 2 stranger men up to the house to try to speak to old Ben, their father, but not to let their mother know of their being in the neighborhood. The men succeeded in rousing old Ben, who came out, and as soon as he heard their story, he gathered together a quantity of provisions and came down to the Fowler house and slipped them inside the door, taking care not to see his children. Up among the ears of corn they lay, and one of them he had not seen for 6 years. It rained very hard all that Sunday, and they there lay all day, for they could not start till night. At about daybreak John joined them. There were wide chinks in the boards of the Fowler house, and through them they could see their father's cabin. And all day long, every few minutes, they would see the old woman come out, and shading her eyes with her hand, take a long look down the road to see if her children were coming. And when they almost couldn't hear her sigh, as she turned into the house disappointed. 2 or 3 times the old man came down and pushed food inside the door, and after nightfall he came to accompany them part of the way upon their journey. When he reached the Fowler house, he tied his handkerchief tight over his eyes, and 2 of his sons, taking him by each arm, he accompanied them some miles upon their journey. Then they bade him farewell and left him standing blindfolded in the middle of the road. When he could no longer hear their footsteps, he took off their handkerchiefs and turned back. But before leaving, they had gone up to the cabin to take a silent farewell of the poor old woman. Though the little window of the cabin, they saw the old woman sitting by her fire with a pipe in her hand, her head on her hand, rocking back and forth as she did, when she was in trouble, and wondering what new evil had come to her children. With streaming eyes, they watched her for 10 to 15 minutes, but time was precious, and they must reach their next station before daybreak, and so they turned sadly away. When the holidays were over and the men came for the 3 brothers to sell them, they could not be found. The first place to search was, of course, the plantation, where all the relatives and friends lived. They went to the big house and asked the doctor if he had seen anything of them. The doctor said no. They mostly came up there to see the other niggers when they came for Christmas, but they hadn't been around at all. Haven't been down to old Ben's? The doctor asked. Yes. What does old Rick say? Oh, Rick says he's not one of them came for Christmas. She was looking for him most of the day and most broke her heart about it. What does old Ben say? Old Ben says that he hasn't seen one of his children this Christmas. Well, if old Ben says that, they haven't been around. And so the manhunters went out disappointed. One of the other brothers, William Henry, had long been attached to a girl named Catherine, who lived with another master, but her master would not let her marry him. When William Henry made up his mind to start with Harriet, he determined to bring Kathleen with him. And so he went to the tailor's and bought a new suit of men's clothes and threw them over the garden fence of Catherine's master. The gardener ran down to a run, and Catherine had been notified where to find the clothes. When the time had come to get ready, Kathleen went to the foot of the garden and dressed herself in the suit of men's clothes. She was soon missed, and all the girls in the house were set to looking for Catherine. Presently they saw coming through the garden as if from a river a well-dressed little darky, and they all stopped looking for Catherine to stare at him. He walked directly by them round the house and went out the gate without the slightest suspicion of being excited as to who he was. In a fortnight from that time the whole party were safe in Canada. William Henry died in Canada, but Catherine had been seen and talked with by the writer at the house of the old people. Of the many letters, testimonies, and passes passed in the hands of the writer by Harriet, the following were selected for insertions in this book and are quite sufficient to verify her statements. A letter from General Sackton to Our Lady of Auburn, Atlanta, Georgia, March 21st, 1868. My dear Madam, I have just received your letter informing me that Honorable William H. Stewart, Secretary of State, would present a petition to Congress for a pension to Harriet Tubman for services rendered in the Union Army during the late war. I can bear witness to the value of her services in South Carolina and Florida. She was employed in the hospitals and as a spy. She made many a raid inside the enemy's lines, displaying remarkable courage, zeal, and fidelity. She was employed by General Hunter and I think by General Stevens and Sherman, and as deserving of a pension from the government for her services as any other of its faithful servants. I am truly, verily yours, Rufus Saxton, BVT, Brigadier General, USA. Letter from the Honorable William H. Stewart, Washington, July 25th, 1868. Madam General Hunter, my dear sir, Harriet Tubman, a colored woman, has been nursing our soldiers during nearly all the war. She believes she has a claim for faithful services to the command in South Carolina, which you are connected, and she thinks that you would be disposed to see her claim justly settled. I have known her long, and a nobler and higher spirit of a truer seldom dwells in human form. I commend her therefore. Faithfully yours, William H. Stewart. Letter from Colonel James Montgomery, St. Helena Island, South Carolina, July 6, 1863. Headquarters, Colored Brigade. Bridget General Gilman, Commanding Department of the South. General, I wish to commend to your attention Mrs. Harriet Tubman, a most remarkable woman and invaluable as a scout. I have been acquainted with her character and actions for several years. Walter D. Plowden is a man of tried courage and can be made highly useful. I am, General, your most obliged servant, James Montgomery, Colonel Commander Brigade. Letter from Mrs. General A. Bodard, B-A-I-R-D. Peterborough, November 24th, 1864. The bearer of this, Harriet Tubman, a most excellent woman, who has rendered faithful and good services to our Union Army, not only in the hospital, but in various capacities, having been employed under government at Hilton Head and in Florida, and I commend her to the protection of all officers in whose department she may happen to be. She has been known and esteemed for years by the family of my uncle, Honorable Garrett Smith, as a person of great vicissitude and capacities. Mrs. General A. B-A-I-R-D. Letter from Honorable Garrett Smith, Peterborough, New York, November 4th, 1867. I have known Mrs. Harriet Tubman for many years. Seldom, if ever, have I met with a person more philanthropic, more self-denying, and of more bravery. Nor must I omit to say that she combines with her sublime spirit remarkable discernment and judgment. During the late war, Mrs. Tubman was eminently faithful and useful in the cause of our country. She is poor and has poor parents. Such a servant of the country should be well paid by the country. I hope the government will look into her case. Garrett Smith. Testimonial from Garrett Smith, Peterborough, November 22nd, 1864. The bearer, Harriet Tubman, needs not any recommendation. Nearly all the nation over she has been heard of for her wisdom, integrity, patriotism, and bravery. The cause of freedom owes her much. The country owes her much. I have known Harriet for many years, and I hold her in my highest esteem. Garrett Smith. Certificate from Henry K. Durant, Acting Assistant Surgeon, USA. I certify that I have been acquainted with Harriet Tubman for nearly 2 years, and my position as medical officer in charge of contrabands in this town and in the hospital has given me frequent and ample opportunities to observe her general deportment, particularly her kindness and attention. Held. Henry K. Durant, Acting Assistant Surgeon, USA. In charge, Contraband Hospital. Dated at Beaufort, South Carolina, on the 3rd day of May, 1864. I concur fully in the above. R. Saxton, Bridget General, VOL, period. The following are a few of the passages used by Harriet throughout the war. Many others are so defaced that it is impossible to decipher them. Headquarters, Department of the South, Hilton Head, Port Royal, South Carolina, November 19, 1863. Pass the bearer, Harriet Tubman, to Beaufort and back to this place and wherever she wishes to go, and give her free passage at all time, all on government transports. Harriet was sent to me from Boston by Governor Andrew of Massachusetts, and is a valuable woman. She has permission as a servant of the government to pursue such provisions from the commissary she may need. D. Hunter, Major General, Commander. General Gilman, who succeeded General Hunter in command of the Department of the South, appends her signature to the same pass. Headquarters of the Department of the South, July 1st, 1863, continued in force. I. A. Gilman, Bridget General, Commander. Beaufort, August 28, 1862. Will Captain Warfield, Please let, quote, Moses, unquote, have a little bourbon whiskey for medicinal purposes. Henry K. Durant, Acting Assistant Surgeon. War Department, Washington, D.C., March 20th, 1865. Pass, Mrs. Harriet Tubman, colored, to Hilton's Head in Charleston, South Carolina, with free transportation on the government transport. By order of the Secretary of War, Lewis H., Assistant Adjutant General, USA, to BVT, Bridget General Van VLIET, at USQM NU, not transferable. Ending off on page 69 at the very end. Some scenes in the War Department, Washington, D.C., July 22nd, 1865. Permit Harriet Tubman to proceed to Fortress Monroe, Virginia, on a government transport. Transportation will be furnished free of cost by the order of the Secretary of War, L.H., Assistant Adjutant General, non-transferable. Appointment as nurse. Sir, I have the honor to inform you that the Medical Director, Department of Virginia, has been instructed to appoint Harriet Tubman, nurse or matron, at the Colored Hospital, Fort Monroe, Virginia. Very respectfully, your Honorable William H. Stewart, Secretary of State, Washington, D.C. Names of Harriet's assistants, scouts, or pilots. Scouts who are residents of Beaufort and well acquainted with the mainland: Peter Barnes, Mont Blake, Sandy Selters, Solomon Gregory, Isaac Hayward, Gabriel Coham, George Chisholm. Pilots who know the channels of the river in this vicinity and who acted as much for Colonel Montgomery up the Combahee River: Charles Simmons, Samuel Hayward. APP''D, R. Sexton, Bridge General. At this point, the following good and kind letter from Reverend Harry Fowler is received. Auburn, June 23rd, 1868. My dear friend, I wish to say to you how gratified I am that you are writing the biography of Harriet Tubman. I feel that her life forms part of the history of the country, and that it ought not to depend upon tradition to keep it in remembrancy. Had not the pressure of professional claims prevented, I should have aspired to be her historian myself. But my disappointment in this regard is more than meet by the satisfaction experienced in hearing that you are the chosen Marian of the African Moses, the name by which she was known among her emancipated followers from the land of bondage. Blessed be God, a greater than Moses has at last broken every bond. As ever, with warm regard, your friend, Henry Fowler. The second account of the subject of this memoir is cut from the Boston Commonwealth of 1863, kindly sent the letter by Mr. Sanborn. It was said long ago that the true romance of America was not in the fortunes of the Indian, where Cowper sought it, nor in the New England character, where Judd found it, nor in the social contrast of Virginia planters, as Thackeray imagined, but in the story of the fugitive slaves. The observation is as true now as it was before war. With swift, gigantic hand stretched the vast shadows and dashed in the high lights in which romance loves to lurk and flash forward. But the stage is enlarged on which these dramas are played. The whole world now sits as spectators, and the desperation of the magnanimity of a poor black woman has power to shake the nation that so long was deaf to her cries. We write of one of these heroines on whom our slave annuals are full, a woman whose career is as extraordinary as the most famous of her sex can show. Araminta Ross was known by her married name of Tubman, with her pseudonym Christian name changed to Harriet, is the granddaughter of a slave imported from Africa and has not a drop of white blood in her vein. Her parents were Benjamin Ross and Harriet Green, both slaves, but married and faithful to each other. They still live in old age and poverty, but free, on a little property in Elburn, New York, which their daughter purchased for them from Mr. Stewart, the Secretary of State. She was born, as near as she can remember, in 1820 or 1821 in Dorchester County, on the eastern shore of Maryland, and not far from the town of Cambridge. She had 10 brothers and sisters, of whom 3 are now living, all at the North, and all rescued from slavery by Harriet before the war. She went back just as the South was preparing to secede, to bring away a fourth, but before she could reach her, she was dead. 3 years before, she had brought away her old father and mother at great risk to herself. When Harriet was 6 years old, she was taken from her mother and carried 10 miles to live with James Cook, whose wife was a weaver, to learn the trade of weaving. While still a mere child, Cook to watching his muskrat traps, which compelled her to wade through the water. It happened that she was once sent, when she was ill with the measles, and taking cold from wading in the water, into condition she grew very sick, and her mother persuaded her master to take her away from Cook's until she could get well. Another attempt was made to teach her weaving, but she would not learn, for she hated her mistress and did not want to live at home, as she would have done as a weaver, for it was the custom then to weave the cloth for the family, or a part of it, in the house. Soon after she entered her teens, she was hired out as a field hand, and it was while thus employed that she received a wound which nearly proved fatal, from the effects of which she still suffers. In the fall of the year, the slaves there work in the evening, cleaning up wheat, husking corn, etc. On this occasion, one of the slaves of a farmer named Barrett left his work and went to the village store in the evening. The overseer followed him, and so did Harriet. When the slave was found, the overseer swore he should be whipped, and called on Harriet, among others, to help tie him. She refused, and as the man ran away, she placed herself in the door to stop the pursuit. The overseer caught up a 2-pound weight from the counter and threw it at the fugitive, but it fell short and struck Harriet a stunning blow on the head. It was long before she recovered from this, and it has left her subject to a sort of stupor or lethargic at times, coming upon her in the midst of conversation or whatever she may be doing, and throwing her into a deep slumber, from which she will presently rouse herself or go on with her conversation or work. After this she lived for 5 or 6 years with John Stewart, where at first she worked in the house, but afterwards hired her time, and Dr. Thompson, son of her master's guardian, stood with her for her. That is, was her surety for the payment of what she owed. She employed the time thus hired in the rudest labors, drove oxen, carted, plowed, and did all the work of a man, sometimes earning money enough in a year beyond what she paid her master to buy a pair of steers worth $40. The amount exacted of a woman for her time was $50 or $60, of a man $100 to $150. Frequently, Harriet worked for her father, who was a timber inspector and superintended the cutting and hauling of great quantities of timber for the Baltimore shipyards. Stewart, his temporary master, was a builder, and for the work of Ross used to receive as much as $5 a day sometimes, he being a superior workman. While engaged with her father, she would cut wood, haul logs, etc. Her usual stint was half a cord of wood in a day. Harriet is married somewhere between 1844 to a free-colored man named John Tubman, but she had no children. For the last 2 years of slavery she lived with Dr. Thompson, before mentioned, her own master not being yet of age, and Dr. T's father being his guardian as well as the owner of her own father. In 1849 the young man died, and the slaves were to be sold, though previously set free by an old will. Harriet resolved not to be sold, and so with no knowledge of the North, having only heard of Pennsylvania and New Jersey, she walked away one night alone. She found a friend and a white lady who knew her story and helped her on her way. After many adventures, she reached Philadelphia, where she found work and earned a small stock of money. With this money in her purse, she traveled back to Maryland for her husband, but she found him married to another woman and no longer caring to live with her. This, however, was not until 2 years after her escape, for she does not seem to have reached her old home in her first two expeditions. In December 1850, she had visited Baltimore and brought away her sister and two children, who had come up from Cambridge in a boat under charge of her sister's husband, a free black. A few months after she had brought away her brother and two other men, it was not until the fall of 1851 that she found her husband and learned of his infidelity. She did not give way to rage or grief, but collected a party of fugitives and brought them safely to Philadelphia. In December of the same year, she returned and led out a party of 11, among them her brother and his wife. With these she journeyed to Canada and there spent the winter, for this was after the enforcement of Macy's fugitive slave bill in Philadelphia and Boston, and there was no safety except under the paw of the British lion, as she quaintly said. But the first winter was terribly severe for these poor runaways. They earned their bread by chopping wood in the snows of the Canadian forest. They were frostbitten, hungry, and naked. Harriet was their good angel. She kept house for her brother, and the poor creatures boarded with her. She worked for them, begged for them, prayed for them, with the strange familiarity of communion with God, which seems natural to these people, and carried them, by the help of God, through the hard winter. In the spring, she returned to the States, and, as usual, earned money by working in hotels and families as a cook. From Cape May, in the fall of 1852, she went back once more to Maryland and brought away 9 more fugitives. Up to this time she had expended chiefly her own money in these expeditions, money which she had earned by hard work and the drudgery of the kitchen. Never did anyone more exactly fulfill the sense of George Herbert: a man with his claws makes drudgery divine. But it was not possible for such virtues long to remain hidden from the keen eyes of the abolitionist. She became known to Thomas Garrett, the large-hearted Quaker of Wilmington, who has aided the escape of 3,000 fugitives. She found warm friends in Philadelphia and New York and wherever she went. These gave her money, which she never spent for her own use, but laid up for the help of her people, and especially for her journeys back to the land of Egypt, as she called her old home, by reason of her frequent visits there. Always carrying away some of the oppressed, she got among her people the name of Moses, which it seems she still retains. Between 1852 and 1857, she made but 2 of these journeys, in consequence partly of the increased vigilance of the slaveholders who had suffered so much by the loss of their property. A great reward was offered for her capture, and she several times was on the point of being taken, but always escaped by her quick wit or by warnings from heaven. For it is time to notice one singular trait of her character. She is the most shrewd and practical person in the world, yet she is a firm believer in omens, dreams, and warnings. She declares that before her escape from slavery, she used to dream of flying over fields and towns and rivers and mountains, looking down upon them like a bird, and reaching at last a great fence, or sometimes a river, over which she would try to fly. But it paired like I wouldn't have it the strength, and just as I was sinking down, there would be ladies all dressed in white over there, and they would put out their arms and pull me cross. There is nothing strange in this, perhaps, but she declares that when she came north she remembered these very places, as though she had seen her dreams, and many of the ladies who befriended her were those who had been helped by in her visions. Then she says she always knows when there is danger near. She does not know how exactly, but pairs like my heart go flutter, flutter, and then they may say, Peace, peace, as much as they likes. I know it's going to be war. She's very firm on this point and ascribes to this her great impunity, in spite of the lethargic being mentioned, which would seem likely to throw her into the hands of her enemies. She says she inherited this power, that her father could always predict the weather, and that he foretold the Mexican War. In 1867 she made her most venturesome journey, for she brought with her to the north her old parents, who were no longer able to walk such distances as she might go by night. Consequently, she must hire a wagon for them, and it required all her ingenuity to get them through Maryland and Delaware safe. She accomplished it, however, and by the aid of her friends, she brought them safe to Canada, where they spent the winter. Her account of their sufferings there, of her mother's complaining, and her own philosophy about it, is a lesson of trust and providency better than in many sermons. But she decided to bring them to a more comfortable place, and so she negotiated with Mr. Stuart, then in the Senate, for a little patch of ground with a house on it at Auburn, near his own home. To the credit of the Secretary of State, it should be said that he sold her the property on very favorable terms, and gave her some time for payment. To this house she removed her parents, and set herself to work to pay for her purchase. It was on this errand that she first visited Boston, we believe in the winter of 1858-1859. She brought a few letters from her friends in New York, but she could herself neither read nor write, and she was obliged to trust to her wits that they were delivered to the right persons. One of them, as it happened, was to the present writer, who received it by another hand, and called to see her at her boarding house. It was curious to see the caution with which she received her visitors, until she was assured that there was no mistake. One of her means of security was to carry with her the daguerreotypes of her friends, and show them to each new person. If they recognized the likeness, then it was all right. Pains were taken to secure her the attention to which her great service to humanity entitled her, and she left New England with a handsome sum of money towards the payment of her debt to Mr. Stuart. Before she left, however, she had several interviews with Captain Brown, then in Boston.